the change is going to have to come from the grassroots. It's going to have to come from the people. And again, politicians respond to pressure. Right now, for a lot of politicians, the more persuasive pressure is from funders, from other politicians, and is persuading them to moderate their stance. Well, we are not powerless. We can still pressure not only politicians and elected leaders, but pastors and our neighbors and other church leaders into, again, at least, which is the minimum, being more vocal in solidarity with Palestinians, right?
Okay, folks, I've been wanting to have this conversation for a long time. I am joined here by Jemar Tisby, a well-known historian on racism and the church. He's the author of the well-known work, The Color of Compromise, The Truth About the American Church's Complicity and Racism, and more recently, The Spirit of Justice, True Stories of Faith, Race, and Resistance. We discuss Jemar's background and his trip to Palestine that has shaped his identity and his faith and his understanding of the conflict over there. And we talk about the affinity or the connections that so many Black Americans and African Americans in general feel and have towards Palestinians and their experience in Palestine. We discuss this idea, God of the oppressed, God who feels with and who is aligned with those who suffer, those who are oppressed. Very clear connections between the Black story in the US and the Palestinian one. All of that is in this conversation. So here is, for the first time ever on Across the Divide, the one and only Jemar Tisby. Jemar Tisby, welcome to Across the Divide. So for the audience sake, we met in March of 2025. We were on this trip together with Talos Group. We were in the American South. And we had this beautiful experience of Palestinians and other Americans and yourself exploring the history of racism, segregation, incarceration in the US, and just a beautiful, profound, heartbreaking connection between both experiences. So I'm like, okay, well, I have Jemar's contact information. So how can I get him to the podcast? But then we were together also more recently at the Church of the Crossroads conference. I'm like, okay, well, this is my chance. I'm going to shoot my shot. Hopefully Jemar could join me. So yeah, welcome to the podcast.
Brother, I was waiting for the invitation. I was like, when will I ever get called up to the big show? I don't know if I have the juice. It's an honor to be here. I'm so grateful for the work that you're doing in these conversations.
Dude, yeah, this is an honor for me, man, as well. I think your voice is so necessary, so profound. We need more of these public Christian intellectuals speaking up on this issue, because there's an issue with a lot of silence and complicity. So I'm just so grateful for you, man, and the work you're doing. Okay, so to kick off the conversation, I got to hear a bit about your story, your background, and your time in Jerusalem and Palestine and Israel. So could you just kind of tell us about your time when you were in college 5 years ago, obviously, when you spent some time in Jerusalem, and kind of the way and how that impacted your identity, your faith, your scholarship?
It was transformative for me. So I'm in college. It's my sophomore year. I had always planned to study abroad somewhere. To be honest, Jerusalem, Palestine wasn't necessarily on my radar. I didn't know they had a program, but I went to an information meeting. It sounded really cool. I signed up just to get the announcements. The next email I get is like, welcome to the program. I'm like, whoa, that moved a lot faster than I thought. But I was glad. Because spending time over there gave me a global perspective, obviously on Israel-Palestine itself, but also the connection and the solidarity between oppressed peoples of all kinds. So ever since I lived there for several months, a semester, I have felt the sort of kinship of suffering that the Bible talks about between Palestinians and Black people in the United States. So I'm really grateful for that. We got to take classes. We got a really robust experience. So we took classes at Bethlehem University, took classes at in Jerusalem at Hebrew University, and got to interact with all kinds of people. But I will say that going to the West Bank, it felt like being in majority Black communities in the United States. And I say that because there was kind of the surface stuff the rhythm and the beat of the music. I love the hand drums over there. I brought one back with me. Never got good at it, but I appreciate it. The culinary culture, just the love, the spices, the flavor in the food. On a deeper level, it was the hospitality, the way we were welcomed in. And so many people were just like, whatever we have, which is not that much in a lot of cases, is yours to share with us. And this invitation to their culture, even to their homes, this invitation, just come understand us. Just what we want is for people to have an accurate picture of our humanity, and in so many ways that mirrors what Black Americans have done over generations of racial prejudice in the United States. So I always have a tender spot in my heart for Palestinians in that experience.
Yeah, and you picked up some Arabic words. I remember, like you picked up some words that you've been using. Also, like in your talk at the conference, you threw out some words for us. But that's so great. But also, you talked about your experience going through the checkpoint and
Oh,
kind of noticing the discrimination and so on. Can you help us kind of explain that to the audience?
it felt like police profiling. Like
Mm, yeah.
it was, in the United States, even as far back as being in junior high, early high school, I became accustomed to being hyper visible to law enforcement. And so being followed around stores, being pulled over for no reason, I've been stopped and frisked, all of these things. And all of the Black men I know have these stories of just intrusion from law enforcement, and because of their visual identity, right? And I had that same. It was almost like a flashback when I was in Jerusalem, because we were staying right outside of a checkpoint, and I would see every morning just these like day laborers going from the West Bank, from Bethlehem into Jerusalem for work. They're gainfully employed. They're providing valuable services for people, and just on a whim, a soldier could ruin their entire day. They could hassle them, search them, deny them entry, and all at gunpoint. Not that they were pointing the guns, but the threat. Just the fact that these were armed people who can control your comings and goings every day. And the other shocking part was, because of the compulsory military service in Israel, these are young people, so young, no experience, no wisdom, and yet they have the power of life and death in their hands, literally. And it just seems so unfair and so unjust. And that was evident to me even as a college student, just learning about the contours of the conflict. And it's something I wish more people understood.
Yeah. And this was easy for you to recognize. There's a pattern that you recognize, which maybe what would have been more difficult for, say, your white colleagues. So by the way, you were at Notre Dame. Not that you want to hide that. You were at the University of Notre Dame. You stayed at Tantour in Jerusalem. So yeah, this was an easy pattern, an easy phenomenon for you to recognize. There's also the element of the exploitation of the Palestinian workers in Israel. They use a lot of Palestinian labor because it's much cheaper than Israeli labor.
Mm-hmm.
And there's a connection to sharecropping and the abuse of the Black worker in the US during segregation. And even until today, where the average Black worker makes less than the majority, or the white American. This kind of makes me think of the Ta-Nehisi Coates experience also in Palestine, when
Mm-hmm.
he went to Hebron. He went to Bethlehem as well. He went to Jerusalem, and he was like, "Oh wait, this looks like Jim Crow. It's not complicated, right?" Could you kind of, I'm sure this was also your experience then. Could you kind of help us navigate through this? Why it's not complicated for you to make that connection between the Palestine-Israel and also the Black experience?
Absolutely. So let me share that quote from Coates, because he puts it so powerfully. He said, "The most shocking thing about my time over there is just how uncomplicated it is. I'm not saying the details of it aren't complicated. History is always complicated. But the way this is reported in the Western media is as if you need a PhD in Middle Eastern studies to understand the basic morality of holding a people in a situation in which they don't have basic rights. And I really appreciated him saying that from a moral standpoint, this isn't nearly as complicated as a lot of people try to portray. Coates went on to say, I don't know anybody who benefits, who stands on the shoulders of our ancestors, could see what is happening right now, could see the bombs being dropped in service of Jim Crow and segregation and be okay with that. So again, Coates is commenting from a moral perspective. These are situations of moral clarity. And he was able to recognize it not incidentally because he was Black, because he has an experience of oppression and injustice, both personally and historically as a people. So at the Church at the Crossroads conference, I talked about this kind of pattern recognition that occurs. So I said oppression trains the mind to scan for power dynamics, control mechanisms, and dehumanizing narratives because our survival often depends on it. So it's that sense that oppression sharpens pattern recognition. So I'm all the way on another continent, in another country, and I can recognize power dynamics. I can recognize the dehumanizing narratives. I can recognize the mechanisms of control. And by the way, that pattern recognition applies to oppress people everywhere. So when I was in South Africa, I could see the colorism and how those power dynamics worked. When I was in Northern Ireland and Belfast, I could see the power dynamics between Protestants and Catholics. When I'm in the US South, I can see that. When I took a trip to the US Mexico border, I could see the power dynamics. And when you have experienced oppression, whether racism, sexism, classism, some other ism, you should be able to, if you have a tender conscience, recognize it when you see it, even when it's not your own context. And that's what I experienced. And I think a lot of people would experience that, but there's so few people from the US who have any meaningful contact with Palestinians or any depth of knowledge about this situation.
Yeah, makes sense. Do you think then on the flip side, then, well, to follow that last point, do you think that's why, or that's maybe one of the reasons why so many Americans who are mostly do not come from that space of oppression would be so apathetic or to the Palestinian struggle? Maybe the Palestinians are invisible to them because they perhaps have not gone through that experience of oppression. So they don't have the pattern recognition abilities to see what's happening in Palestine.
I absolutely think that's part of it. It's going to be harder. It's not impossible at all because we know of white American allies to the Palestinians, but you're going to have to work harder if that hasn't been your personal experience. You're going to have to not only study in sort of an intellectual sense, but actually develop relationships. And also it helps if you can be on the ground and see the reality that isn't filtered through a screen or some media outlet telling you the story and what you should pay attention to. So it's completely possible, but it does make it more uphill because you don't necessarily know from a personal standpoint what it's like to be oppressed as a people. Now, white people in the US are so highly individualistic that they'll say, well, I have suffered, I grew up poor, I had an abusive parent, alcoholic, whatever. That is true. I understand that's a form of hardship, but it's not because of your racial identity. It's not because of your religious identity. And that's the part that I think is a disconnect for a lot of white people in the US is they don't quite get the whole thing of I'm experiencing prejudice because of my identity is this in this group, like Black people would, like Palestinians would, like women would, right? So that I think is part of it. The other aspect, which I'm sure we'll talk about, is the way that certain Christian narratives feed an anti-Arab, anti-Muslim narrative that the Palestinians get lumped into. So it's a lot easier not to have empathy for them.
Right. Yeah. You famously wrote The Color of Compromise, where you unpack the complicity of the church in racism in the US. And I'm wondering if there's that. We need to also unpack the color of compromise towards Palestinians, that the church
Mm,
itself is also guilty of that racism, of anti Palestinian bigotry, which is a form of racism as well. So I think there's we need to kind of unpack that, and I can make a lot of connections between racism in the US, the dehumanization of black people, and that of Palestinians. I mean, different looking people, brown, dark skinned people, not white, not Western, not European. So I think there's an element of that we also have to reckon with. I think the church in the US has to reckon with. And alongside its own reckoning with the history of racism, which also continues today, we also have to reckon with that history of racism towards Arabs and Palestinians as well.
100%. I mean, one of the things that people maybe don't have a firm enough grasp on is that racism, anti-Black racism, is a subset of the broader ideology of white supremacy. And white supremacy sweeps up all people in it, right? So globally, so it's not just a US thing. This is a global project where white supremacy says those considered white are at the top and the center of whatever society they inhabit. They should have the most money. They should have the most power. They should have the most say wherever they go because they're superior in some sense. And I hasten to say, most people are probably not consciously buying into white supremacy. If you ask them directly, are you a white supremacist or do you believe in white supremacy? They'd say no. But the insidious part is what they think is normal, is standard, is best, often corresponds with whiteness, white culture, white norms, everything down to the language we speak, to the books we read. You hear a lot about Western civilization and a classical curriculum, mainly from Europe, right? Not just ignoring the wisdom of other people groups, right? And of course, it's going to come down to skin color, race, religion, etc. So one of the other aspects of white supremacy is that race and religion become intertwined, so that Christianity gets coded as white, and atheism, paganism, any other religion gets coded as non-white. So if you're a quote good Christian American, you're actually going to be opposed religiously to Muslims and to brown-skinned people because of the ways race and religion have become so intertwined.
There is this recent phenomenon now with people on the right, like Tucker Carlson and so on, who are objecting now to the Israeli influence over the U.S. about AIPAC, and very critical, kind of following this America First model. But I always feel uncomfortable because there's a lot of excitement about this. Like, oh wait, the people on the right are now shifting, and this is great. But also, when you listen to Tucker and others talk about this issue, one of the main talking points is like the suffering of Christian Palestinians under Israel. So and we're kind of being propped up as an example why we should not support Israel because Christians are suffering. And now, like what you're saying right now makes sense, because now we are seen as the white people, the Palestinian Christians, right? That we need to support them because they are Christians. And there's little that Tucker Carlson is saying about Muslims in general, who are the majority who suffer. There's also, during the genocide, there was an attack on a church, the Catholic Church. I think 3 Christians were killed, and there was this uproar. Even Trump called Netanyahu about it. I'm like, if you're so concerned about the killing of innocents, in this case, the prototype, the perpetual innocent, the Christian, you think that if you're so concerned about the innocents, you would have called Netanyahu every day because of the innocent Muslims who are being killed on a daily basis. But no, it's the Christian who was killed, therefore we talk about them. So it seems that's also at play here, that there's this, we protect the Christian Palestinian, we're concerned about them, but then we're silent about the suffering of Muslims, who are the vast majority of the Palestinians.
100%. And even the Christian part, or the concern about Christian part, is suspect. And the domestic US example I cite is the so-called anti-Christian bias task force that the White House put together. And what they're claiming is the need for this task force is that people in the United States who are serious about their faith and sincere Christians, they're being discriminated against. Well, by which they mean uh, the people who don't want to bake cakes for LGBTQ couples, or the people who want the Ten Commandments and prayer in school. What the White House is claiming is that those kind of folks are being shut down. Well, it just so happens to correspond to this fundamentalist evangelical style of Christianity that I would call white Christian nationalism. And that's who they have in mind when they're saying supposedly that Christians are being discriminated against. They don't have in mind uh, Christians like the ones you represent or interview on your show, who are supporting justice causes. Y'all would be considered too woke. You would be considered not their kind of Christian, if Christian at all. And so they're very selective in who they consider part of their religious family. And it is tends to be convenient or not costly to them at all to have solidarity with those kind of Christians.
Yeah, there is going back to the issue of kind of the connection between the Palestinian and the black person. Gideon Levy, an Israeli historian or journalist, excuse me, he made this comment in a talk he gave like a year or so ago, where he was saying that in the Western white imagination, yesterday it was a Jewish person that was disregarded and dehumanized, as we saw through anti-Semitism and the Holocaust. And now he says, Gideon Levy, now the Jew, or the Israeli, the Jew has become the new white man, and the Palestinian is now the new Jew. And I think to connect those two thoughts, it's like it seems today that the Palestinian is also the new black man, right? It's the person that we can dehumanize, we can blame, and we can justify and their suffering, and there's public spectacles of lynching, right? We saw this in the museums both of us visited and so on. So there's this kind of spectacle now of the suffering of the Palestinian, and you see politicians and so on would say, oh yeah, they deserve to die, it's fine. So now the Palestinian has become the new black person that can be dehumanized. So it's beautiful, it's a profound connection, but it's also so tragic. Like, this is still happening in 2025. We still have those dehumanizing discourses that are so prevalent.
So, I mean, what I glean from what you're saying is an idea that has coalesced over my travels to high conflict areas around the globe, which is that there, in any major conflict between people groups, I'm not talking one-on-one arguments, right? I'm talking about groups of people. In any major conflict between groups of people, there's always an oppressor and oppressed. Mm-hmm. And the two are not equal in terms of resources. So the oppressor typically has the power of the gun, the power of the political governmental office, the power of the microphone. Their voices get heard more often, right? Now, again, you can go around the globe and see how this is the case. You can look at pictures. Typically, if you see the two forces arrayed against each other, there's a side with tanks and automatic weapons, and there's a side with rocks and bottles. It is not equivalent in terms of resources. And often there's a moral imbalance too, that the side with rocks and bottles is typically standing up for the oppressed, typically standing up for the poor, typically standing up for the people with their backs against the wall, as Howard Thurman would say. And so that's what I think this author is getting at, is like, if you are familiar in your own context with the oppressor and oppressed. So in the United States, for me, that would be white people inflicting oppression on Black people. If you're familiar with those categories, then you can kind of more easily spot them. And that also leads me to I mean, there's been theology about this. So James Cone, of course, is known as the father of Black liberation theology, and he writes the book God of the Oppressed, in which he says the God of biblical faith and Black religion is best known as the liberator of the oppressed from bondage. And he goes on to say that while we must begin our theological reflection with the particularity of our own struggle for justice, we should never stop there. The truth of our particular struggle pushes us beyond ourselves to the truth of other struggles. And that's what I think we're pointing at here. That's what I experienced without having the words for it when I studied abroad in Israel, Palestine, was that my understanding of God as a Black Christian is that God is a liberator of the oppressed from bondage. And I understood that from my particular struggle against anti-Black racism in the United States. But that also pushed me beyond myself to the truth of the struggles that Palestinians experience as well. So our theology should lead to solidarity.
You would hope, yeah, you would hope. And I love that you just mentioned Howard Thurman. In the beginning of the book, he says, well, what does the religion of Jesus say to people who have their backs against the wall? And then he goes on to say, if you understand Jesus as a Jewish person, as a poor person, one under occupation, the Roman occupation, then how does that transform the way that we think about Jesus? And then how does the religion of Jesus, Christianity, address the moment we're in? So I'm so glad we can do this work, and thankfully we have Cone and Howard Thurman and others that could emphasize this idea of the God of the oppressed, the God who is on the side of the oppressed. That's not very common for the average person. The majority of our listeners aren't really Black, so maybe they're not really understand that language of God of the oppressed. Could you just help us make sense of that? How does that actually work? Are you saying that God takes sides? I think, at the conference you were wearing this shirt, I actually have it behind you. Justice takes sides. Help us kind of unpack that. You seem to say that God has some preferences, or that he is partial to some people. How does that work out exactly?
Absolutely, positively, God takes sides. God is
Okay.
not
Yep.
neutral.
Okay.
God takes sides. God is on the side of the oppressed, and we see this throughout the Bible. In the prophets, God condemns unjust rulers who have the power to oppress people, and he defends the poor and the marginalized. In Jesus, God becomes flesh, takes on flesh, and inhabits a particular context and social location. God does not incarnate as a wealthy ruler, but as a poor laborer in a colonized land, and eventually is executed at the hands of the state and the religious powers that be. If that is not God in solidarity with the oppressed of the world, I don't know what is. So, as a Black Christian, my response to Gaza is that God understands the oppressed, and God, the same God who stands with Black people in our plight against racism and slavery and segregation and Jim Crow and lynching and all of those things. That's the same God of the oppressed who stands with Palestinians in their struggle for self-determination and human rights and even their very existence. And so that, in that sense, I think we serve a God of the oppressed because we serve a God of justice, and justice takes sides.
Yeah, I mean, the other book of James Cone that we can refer to here is also the cross and the lynching tree, and
Mm-hmm.
there's this beautiful image, right, of Christ who's hung on the cross, and also the Black man who's hung on the lynching tree. So there's a profound connection or kinship, perhaps maybe, between the experience of Christ and the experience of the Black man as well. And if you're extending that comparison, right, there is that connection now between God, between the cross and the people in Gaza today. That Christ is with
Mm.
those The Christ is being bombed as well. And that's the image that Mother Isaac, the Palestinian theologian, that Christ is in the rubble, that Christ is there with the people who suffer.
Yes, and historically, people, not always Christians, they recognized this as well. So I think, I mean, most famously of Malcolm X, who in September of 1964 visited the Khan Yunis refugee camp, and he met with leaders, ate with leaders, heard poetry, all of those things. And then afterwards, he writes an essay called Zionist Logic, in which he calls Zionism a new form of colonialism. And he compared it to European colonialism, in which he said it differs only in form and method, but never in motive or objective. And so he concludes that the Zionist argument to justify Israel's present occupation of Arab Palestine has no intelligent or legal basis in history. So he got it.
Yeah.
There were others. The Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee was considered, was considered even, it was considered sort of radical even among civil rights groups in the US. Like, some folks have to understand that there was a spectrum of activism from Black Americans, as I'm sure is true in Palestine, right? Where some were all in and, were giving everything for the struggle. Some were completely detached from it or tried to assimilate. And then there were a lot in between that were advocates of Black civil rights, but in a more moderate or moderated tone. Well, SNCC was on the extreme. SNCC was like all go everything, and so they were paying attention to the Israel-Palestine dynamics, and they said that the U.S. media was sympathizing with Jewish people to the extent that they were completely ignoring or distorting the plight of the Palestinians. And they said, we were talking earlier about moral clarity, and they said in a document from SNCC that said, it is clearly a question of right and wrong. In the Middle East, America has worked with and used powerful, organized Zionist movement to take over another people's home and to replace these people with a partner who has well served America's purpose, a partner that can help the United States and other white Western countries to exploit and control the nations of Africa and the Middle East. So I think that's a very concise encapsulation of two things. Number one, the fact that from a moral standpoint, it is uncomplicated, as Coates said, that there is clearly an issue of right and wrong.
Yeah.
But the second point is also important in that SNCC was connecting the U.S.'s allyship with Zionists to a broader project that affected even places like Africa. So it's this racist project against darker skinned people, but it's also largely also an exploitative project, a strategic political and economic project to ally with certain people against others. And so they were able to recognize that as far back. This is in the 1960s. And you go up to the late 80s. In 1988, Nelson Mandela makes a statement about solidarity of South Africans and Palestinians. He said, South Africans understand the suffering of the Palestinian people. Palestinians continue to suffer humiliation and economic hardship. Those who live in exile as refugees have for long been sustained by their hope for an end to the conflict and the dawning of a better future. And he's like, we get it. As Black South Africans, we absolutely understand the suffering, the humiliation, the economic hardship, and that long stage where you're simply hoping for an end to the conflict and the dawn of a brighter day.
Yeah. And Mandela goes on to say, I think in the 90s, that the freedom of Black African Americans is incomplete without the liberation, the freedom of the Palestinian people. So, I mean, Jemar, you're taking us from SNCC, Stokely Carmichael, Malcolm X. We can talk about Muhammad Ali. and others all the way till today. You have Angela Davis, who wrote the book on From Ferguson to Palestine. We mentioned Ta-Nehisi Coates. So that's great. I mean, the connection has been made. You can easily make the connection between James Cone's writings, Howard Thurman's writings to today. We could quote Dr. King as well, and we can say, well, yeah, this could easily be applied to the Palestinians. However, the question then, Jemar, then where are the Black Christians who are making those connections today? There's you're making that connection. But it seems that we still have a problem here that we're not seeing a lot of Black Christians who are making those connections, who are writing these books. Help us unpack that. Why are Black, not to generalize, but why so many Black Americans are silent when it comes to this issue?
I think in the most generous reading, because I believe, I agree, we can be more, at the very least, more vocal. That's not asking a lot of your U.S. Black brothers and sisters. We can be more vocal. I think the most generous reading of why it appears that we're not more vocal is ignorance. There's a lot of folks who have been fed the narrative that this is too complicated to understand, and so immediately disengage. Plus, there's also this kind of overall American arrogance that we're the center of the globe. We don't really need to learn about anybody or anything else. Everybody learns about us, and we don't have to maneuver the same way. That's on one level. On another level, it's more insidious, where I think Black Christians in the United States have been fed the same theology of white evangelicals. So even currently, as we record this, there's this conversation going on among Black Christians about anti-Black Black Christian pastors. So these are Black pastors who are saying things like, this isn't a Black church, or I'm Christian before I'm Black, and we don't need to play the victims, right? These are the same talking points that white evangelicals have fed us, and they've never actually served our community well. So I think there's also an infiltration of that same theology that is either going to take a quietist stance toward Palestine, or actually oppose Palestinians because of the narratives they've been exposed to. So it is few. It is far too few, I think, people who are A, educated about this, and B, outspoken about this. And then the third reason is oppression takes up a lot of bandwidth. When you are tasked with daily survival, you don't have a lot of margin left over for vocal solidarity and activism toward other oppressed groups. And it's not an oppositional thing. It's not even a question necessarily of not caring. It's at this point, we have to worry about SNAP benefits and people having enough money to go grocery shopping. We're worried about healthcare premiums doubling or tripling for some people. And there's also the everyday anti-Black racism that we're dealing with that's also become heightened under this regime in the United States, where you have the U.S. Department of Labor putting out these AI-generated images of white men as like the quintessential American, and throwing us back to like the 1950s or something. So when you have all of those forces combined with just the everyday struggle of life, I also think there's some lack of bandwidth, although not an excuse. Because I go back to the words of Fannie Lou Hamer, one of the civil rights activists and one of my historical heroes. She says, nobody's free until everybody's free.
Yeah. Speaking of that, about the quintessential white person, I think, wasn't it a thing where they removed the pictures of Jackie Robinson from like, I don't know, the records, because he was a successful Black person who fought against discrimination, and that was because that's DEI, so had to remove his image or information about him. So that is happening. That's really helpful, Jemar. But is there also, I'm wondering if also, speaking of the second point you made, which is about white Christian religion, is also, do you see the influence of uh, charismatic or Pentecostal movement in many black churches? We're seeing this a lot in South Africa, where in Africa rather, of kind of the prosperity gospel way of thinking, where many Africans, also in the US, many black churches would adopt prosperity gospel. And we know a lot of these kind of black televangelists who adopt that position. Um, so then blessing Israel will be one of the teachings or one of the ways to get financial benefit as well. So do you see kind of also that element here playing, that many black Christians would be adopting Christian Zionism based on prosperity gospel? Is that a phenomenon to address as well?
So I think there are different forms of prosperity gospels and what particular kind of prosperity they promise. So there's a sense in which white Christian nationalism itself is a kind of prosperity gospel
Hmm.
because it says by adhering to this very strict, narrow, fundamentalist form that they're calling Christianity, it's going to bless America. And by corollary, it's going to bless that individual person or their family, especially if you're white, by restoring your so-called rightful place in the United States or even globally. And so the promise of prosperity of white Christian nationalism is that America would be great again, which essentially means great again for white people. Not that it's not, as we become more diverse and equitable, it helps everyone. But that's the myth. That's the prosperity there. I think it affects the black church insofar as there is a theology in some Pentecostal and charismatic traditions that is very Zionist, and that says that in order to hasten the return of Christ, Israel must be restored. And they're equating the Israel of the Hebrew Bible, the Old Testament, with the modern nation state of Israel and modern geopolitics. And so the way that translates in terms of policy is these Christians, whether they're white or black or Latino or another group, because they bought into this theology, they're going to co-sign anything that the US government says will help Israel. If that's sending them more bombs and guns, if that's sending them more money, if that's sending infrastructure, technology, troops, whatever it might be, they're going to be like, well, this is the Christian thing to do because to the extent Israel is blessed, Jesus will come back sooner. Which is, I think, a grave and gross misreading of scripture and a misunderstanding of prophecy. But unfortunately, because of these roots and routes theologically, there are plenty of people of color who ought to know better because of the experience of their people as a group
Right.
who are buying into these narratives.
Right. I think I made this joke to you before, Jemar, that I would love for you to write the second volume of The Color of Compromise and unpack racism towards the Palestinians also in the church, because also we're noticing it's a double-edged kind of racism. One is from the typical kind of white Christianity, but also there's infiltration of that way of thinking into the black church as well. So I think this would be a really fascinating work to be done. So I'm gonna start a petition here to encourage you to write a book on
we
this
might need
issue.
to co-author that one.
Okay. Let's do that. But I think there's such a fascinating history there that I think we need to unpack, we need to make sense of, because the connections, the parallels are just so obvious, I think, to us.
They really are. And I mean, related to that is the idea of colorism. So one of the other very sticky experiences that I've never forgotten from living in Israel, Palestine, and be on the Israeli side was the anti-black racism I saw there. And so you had Jewish people from across the globe, but some were darker skinned than others. And you had a discrimination toward darker skinned people, even if they themselves were also Jewish. I believe there's a large Ethiopian Jewish population, if I'm not mistaken. But you could see the level of jobs they were able to get, the neighborhoods they lived in, the way they're treated by lighter skinned Jewish people. And again, this is not to single out Jewish people. This is to say that white supremacy is a global project. And so people coded as either white or closer to white. they're going to get more advantages and privileges in different societies, even societies like Israel, which historically Jewish people have been oppressed for being Jewish. They can turn around and be
Yeah,
oppressors.
yeah, yeah. And that's, I mean, to make the connection again with Howard Thurman. I just taught the book to my students, so that's why,
Mm,
because I just reread the book again. But kind of I think chapter 2, when he talks about hate, and he talks about hatred towards black people, but then he gives the example of these two black girls who see some white girls playing in the street, and then they make this very uh, awful comment about, wouldn't it be fun if they fall on the ground and you know their brains splatter out or something. So like, he kind of notices how hate could, obviously it's very obvious towards black people, but also how it could be internalized and then also
mm,
be reflected from black segregated people. So I can see how that could also work for Jewish Israelis, where they adopted the method, the ideology, and also the methods of their oppressors,
yeah.
and the connections have been made about how Jews were treated in Europe and how they're treating Palestinians. So that's like the malady of this kind of generational oppression that could also, where the victim could easily become the victimizer.
Well, you reminded me. I mean, I think it was you who first clued me into the fact that was it is Israeli soldiers teaching U.S. law enforcement tactics
Hmm. Right?
uh,
Yeah.
for crowds and things of that nature, or that's chilling. But you also said it the opposite is also true, where um, protesters and resistors, they're trading tactics as well for survival and how to resist the oppression. And I think that's a cross pollination that's really, really
Yeah.
powerful.
Yeah. Yeah, that's during the George Floyd protests, where
Right.
Palestinian activists were teaching the activists protesting against police brutality about what to use, what to do in response to being tear gassed, and so the methods of the Palestinian resistance was applied also in the U.S. Yeah, there's so many connections there. Jamar, as we wrap up, I also want to push back on the pattern recognition idea that you, as a black person, you can easily make the connection between the black experience and the Palestinian one, by reflecting on a very troubling, confusing phenomenon in the American political system, where you see a lot of black Christian politicians, thinking of Cory Booker, Richie Torres, Hakeem Jeffries, um, who have adopted a very clearly pro-Israel, anti-Palestinian position. And there's a whole irony of Cory Booker, grandstanding and talking about, the legacy of black um, Christianity and what he learned from his church. But then he's also very pro-Israel and apathetic towards the genocide. So it's a very troubling phenomenon that exists among many black politicians. Of course, not everyone. Um, so yeah, I don't know what's your take on, and we're also seeing this in the media. People like Van Jones and Don Lemon, like just kind of falling in line with that narrative. I think what you said previously about white religion and being internalized, I think that could apply. Yeah, how do you assess this moment where we're seeing so many black Christian politicians being pro-Israel?
Some of these folks we don't claim. Like Van Jones has a very fraught relationship with the black community, but the others you mentioned, it is troubling. It is troubling that they wouldn't take a stronger pro-Palestinian, which is essentially pro-human rights stance, right? Um, I think this is my theory, which is not completely explanatory, but maybe part of the picture. My theory is that when you reach a certain level of elected office, that identity as a politician is more important to you than solidarity with oppressed people. So, if you're a senator, you're one of 100 people in the entire nation of like 330 plus million people. That is rare air. And to get there and to stay there, it becomes primary, it becomes paramount to people. And then you get the money factor, right? Who is contributing to their campaigns? Who is financially enabling them to stay in power? Now, I'm not accusing any particular politician or elected official of being that callous. I do think there's got to be an incredible temptation to water down your stances on justice in order not to tick off the people who sign the checks that make your position possible. So I think there's some of that. I also think there's all that other stuff that I mentioned, whether ignorance or drinking the Kool-Aid of white evangelical Zionist theology, or what have you. But here's the thing, too, and what we're seeing very clearly, especially as we record this, Democrats in the Senate caved to pressure from Republicans about the government shutdown, got nothing in return. And what that is reinforcing to me is politicians respond to pressure. They're almost never proactive about the justice that we need. You have to push them to it. And I think the examples you mentioned are case in points of, they could do some good work, but they're going to have to be pressured into it.
Right. There's also the example of Raphael Warnock from Georgia, speaking of senators, who came to Palestine, went to Bethlehem, met with Palestinian Christians, and also gave sermons at his church in Atlanta about the Palestinian issue. And then when he ran for office, his sermons became public, and there was a pushback against him. And then since then he changed his tone, changed his language, came out very pro-Israel. So you can tell, which is a very sad phenomenon, because because what he said in the back in the past and how his preaching was beautiful, but to see him kowtowing like this and bending the knee to the the AIPAC and the lobby and also the Democratic Party, it's just a very tragic phenomenon. Like, I haven't heard anything from him when it comes to Gaza. Maybe there's some kind of lip service to be done, but so that's a kind of tragic phenomenon of a pastor as well, who had to submit to that pressure, perhaps because he wanted to preserve his political career. So yeah, there's a lot of work that is ahead here, but I think there's some work that obviously there's a Black church could offer us a lot, but also there are challenges from within the Black church or the Black politicians or even influencers. So some work should be done, but also the work can be a bit easier if we are doing the work that you are showing us here, that there is a very powerful connection between the Black experience and the Palestinian experience. Any kind of thoughts about all of that, and kind of the responsibility or the work is ahead of us to kind of continue doing this work?
Yeah, I think we're going to be very frustrated if we look to our leaders for leadership, as ironic as that sounds. And in particular, I mean, the people with institutional power and political power. The change is going to have to come from the grassroots. It's going to have to come from the people. And again, politicians respond to pressure. Right now, for a lot of politicians, the more persuasive pressure is from funders, from other politicians, and is persuading them to moderate their stance. Well, we are not powerless. We can still pressure not only politicians and elected leaders, but pastors and our neighbors and other church leaders into, again, at least, which is the minimum, being more vocal in solidarity with Palestinians, right? Yeah. So I want us to remind ourselves, my latest book is The Spirit of Justice, that we do have the spirit of justice, that the work of justice, whether on behalf of Palestinians or Black Americans or other groups, that's not reserved for a special few who do justice work for a living or host podcasts or whatever it might be. It's for all of us, particularly when you say you are a follower of Jesus. We cannot claim to follow Jesus and not pursue justice. Nor is Jesus so cruel as to say, you're supposed to pursue justice, but I'm not going to help you. Jesus is actually not only in solidarity with the oppressed, Jesus empowers the oppressed for the work of justice. And so it's tapping back into that. And we can talk about practical ways to do that. We need to talk about, number one, that pattern recognition. It starts with you recognizing injustice in your own context and working for it where you are. That's what led people like Malcolm X and officials at SNCC to come out vocally in support of Palestinians, because they were doing the work in their own context. And so they recognize, hey, what's not fair here, it's not fair there either. Another thing is just to pay attention to global news. Like, we are, again, so self-centered as Americans. This goes across races, right? That one of the things that people do as they get deeper into the work of justice is recognize the connection, the inescapable network of mutuality, as King said. And one of the ways they do recognize that network is to pay attention to what's happening in other places, whether that's Nigeria, Sudan, Palestine, wherever. And then lastly, I would say, to the extent that it's possible, I called it I call it embodied relational learning. So for me, it was transformative to go to Palestine. It was embodied relational learning because I went to the physical site, I met real human beings, formed relationships, and that's how I learned best what was going on and what part I should play. That is true in all kinds of situations, whether you're trying to understand the situation that Black Americans are facing or any other group. Embodied relational solidarity and learning.
Yeah, wonderful. Jemar, thank you so much. This is so helpful and really insightful, and I really hope the audience would benefit a lot from this. I'm going to make sure to include your Substack and your books in the description. Really thankful for the work you're doing. I think there's some fantastic wisdom for us as we move forward. And thank you for taking us back to Jesus and to the God of the oppressed. But also, there are some very real, specific, practical things that we can do, paying attention to the news, visit and see what's happening on the ground. All in all, thank you so much, Jemar. This has been wonderful. Thank you.
Absolutely. Shukran.
Did you like this episode? If so, make sure to follow Across the Divide and share it with friends and family. If you're watching this on YouTube, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications, and perhaps leave a comment or a like. It actually helps the podcast to reach more people. To support our work, to get exclusive content, perhaps to join our book club, head over to patreon.com/acrossthedivide.